everyone, and welcome to today's lesson. It is our fourth on the era of Reconstruction, and our final. Reconstruction is about to end. Reconstruction did not end suddenly. It ended gradually, and it ended violently. In 1869, Congress made it easier for states to return to the Union, wanted to bring them back, wanted to finally be reunited and put the Civil War behind us. In 1872, amnesty, that's official forgiveness, was given to all but about 600 Confederate officers. Those 600 Confederate officers had done some pretty significant war crimes or had refused to give an oath of loyalty. By the 1870s, the Democratic Party is regaining power in the South, and it will be a Democratic stronghold for quite some time after the Civil War. Now, in Mississippi, the Republican governor was under attack from Democrats. Okay? This was a very deep South state. They did not like Republicans, but the carpetbaggers and scallywags had managed to get this Republican governor in place. But gangs of Democrats are now going around attacking Republicans, Republican voters, Republican officials whenever they tried to gather. So if there was a Republican meeting, the Democrats would show up and they would attack the people who tried to enter. Very violent. Now, the governor raised a militia, informal army, to try to defend voters and to try to keep these roving bands of Democrats away from the polls. But the Republicans were still just too afraid of this violence, and they did not show up to vote, and Democrats win that state back in the early 1870s. Now, emboldened by Mississippi and seeing how effective terrorism was at determining an election, white gangs appear throughout all the southern states, and they would just hang out at polling places looking as intimidating as possible. These gangs would also go beyond intimidation and would actively burn down the homes and businesses of African Americans or white Republicans who voted. So if you showed up to an election and you voted, you ran the risk of being attacked afterward and having your life at risk, and certainly your business and your property. So as Southern Democrats unite around this kind of violent approach to influencing democracy, the Republican Party starts to collapse. And not just in the South, but nationally, the Republican Party is collapsing. President Grant is not a good president. He was a great military general. He helped win the Civil War. All accolades to him for that. But he's not a great president. He chose to appoint a whole bunch of his close friends to offices instead of people who were really qualified for it. He wanted people that he trusted rather than people who knew how to run a government. And his friends really took advantage of this and took advantage of Grant. They misuse their power and they become guilty of bribery, accepting bribes. They misuse public funds for their own personal gains. He's not popular. He's not running an effective government, and he's just not a strong president. And as a result of this misuse of power, the economy of the United States goes into a decline. A serious economic depression results. And as this economic depression takes hold, the government shifts its focus from Reconstruction to fixing the economy. And all the goals of Reconstruction take a back seat. This leads into the election of 1876. Democrats in this election win the majority in southern states. So the Democrats are now firmly back in charge in the South. And they make their first real challenge for the presidency since before the Civil War. Democrats put up a candidate that could win. They're going up against the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. And the Democrats nominate a Northerner, Samuel J. Tilden. This was very strategic. They wanted somebody from the North so they could pull in some Northern votes. But somebody who's a Democrat and falls in line with Democratic beliefs so that the Southern states can support them. So we've got Hayes versus Tilden in 76. Now, this violence at the polls is continuing. In South Carolina, Democrats form what they call rifle clubs. Rifle clubs are a bunch of masked thugs carrying rifles that show up at Republican meetings. So the Republicans try to organize, and they see this group of masked individuals holding rifles standing in front of the meeting, and most of them turn and go home, pretend they had nothing to do with that meeting. Now, the federal government is going to send in troops to protect voters, but this doesn't work out very well. We wind up having armed groups of Republicans and Democrats roving around these states, particularly in the South, and a lot of violent clashes result. You get enough people holding guns, angry and yelling at each other, and bad things happen. So this leads to a disputed election result in 1876. They were inconclusive. Republicans controlled the election boards, though. So the people who certify the votes, the people who are in charge of counting the votes, are all Republicans. So when they count the votes, they give the election to Hayes, the Republican. But a lot of people are saying, hey, that's not fair. That's not how this went. This is not what we're seeing in our states. You guys are cheating. And Democrats threatened to filibuster. A filibuster is a Senate procedure. The Senate has to confirm the presidency. And if they don't, you can't have a new president. And Democrats threatened to do this, to not allow the president to take office. They do eventually compromise, though, and the Democrats allow Hayes to become president, but there are conditions attached to that. Reconstruction has to end. So what does that mean? Well, Reconstruction was largely a failure. This was the attempt to bring the South back in and get them in line with the civil rights ideals of the Northern Republicans following the war. But by 1877, the few rights that African Americans had gotten quickly vanished. States discovered ways to keep African Americans from voting, and they gained support for imposing segregation. One example for how they try to get African Americans to not be allowed to vote is they would put in a clause like this. The 15th Amendment said that you can't discriminate based upon color. That is, you can vote whether you're black or white. But they would put in a law that said you can't vote unless your grandfather voted. Well, enslaved people weren't allowed to vote. So every African American in the South, their grandparents had been enslaved. And if your grandfather couldn't vote, you couldn't vote. And this was just a roundabout way of stealing this right from people. Segregation becomes a long-term result of the failure of Reconstruction. Segregation gets legalized, officially legalized, when the Civil Rights Act of 1875, when the Supreme Court overruled the Civil Rights Act. They said that this act was illegal. So they passed in 1875. In 1883, it gets outlawed, which means Jim Crow laws can be enforced. Jim Crow laws are laws that exist to enforce segregation. These laws were upheld by the Supreme Court. The famous case is Plessy versus Ferguson. We're going to come back and visit this Supreme Court case again when we're talking about the 1950s and 1960s. But this is where it became legal in the United States to have separate but equal facilities. The idea that you would have, one theater for black people and one for white people and separate drinking fountains. That all ties back to this idea put forth and upheld by the United States Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, one of their worst decisions in U.S. history. All right, that was our lesson for today. We talked about amnesty in the South and violence at the polls, the success of the violence at the polls, and how it led to a Southern Democratic resurgence. We talked about the election of 1876 and how that compromise, the compromise of 1876, led to a Republican maintaining control of the presidency, but Reconstruction ending and segregation being held up as legal throughout the United States. I hope that you learned something today. I hope that you enjoyed this lesson as well, and farewell.